somewhere in the world, a baby is being born in a room full of machines, bright lights, beeping monitors, strangers in masks. The moment it arrives, it's measured, wiped, sometimes taken away before the mother even holds it. Now imagine the opposite. No lights, no monitors, no strangers, just fire, breath, and the hands of women who have done this 100 times before. For 300,000 years, this is how every single human being arrived on Earth. Not one exception. Every person you have ever met, every ancestor you have ever had, entered the world this way. So what actually happened? And here's the strange part. The answer might explain something about you that you've never been able to name. Let's start with a fact that sounds almost impossible. Human birth is one of the most dangerous things a mammal can do alone. A horse foals in a field and stands within the hour. A chimpanzee climbs a tree, gives birth in private, and comes down with a baby clinging to her fur. No help, no witnesses. Humans cannot do that. Our babies are born with heads so large and our pelvises so narrow that the baby has to rotate its way out through a canal that barely fits it. Anthropologist Wendy Trevathan, who has spent her career studying this exact problem, found something no other primate shares with us. Human mothers almost always need help to give birth safely. It isn't a cultural preference. It's built into our anatomy. For a horse or a chimp, birth is a private act. For a human, it has always been a group event. So what did that group event actually look like? Across hunter-gatherer societies, the pattern repeats with almost eerie consistency. The mother squats, supported from behind by another woman, often her own mother. Sisters kneel in front of her. An older woman who has delivered dozens of babies before takes the role of midwife. The men leave, they go hunting, or they wait at the far edge of camp. The birth belongs to the women. The umbilical cord is cut with a flake of stone or a sliver of shell, tied off with plant fiber. Sometimes there is singing, sometimes there is complete silence, broken only by breathing and the crackle of a fire. Not every culture did this the same way. Among the Kung of the Kalahari, a woman was expected to walk into the bush alone and give birth by herself, then return to camp hours later carrying her baby. Independence was the ideal, but even then she had almost certainly delivered other women's babies first, and someone was never far if something went wrong. Whatever the version, one thing never changed. The instant the baby arrived, everything that happened next was about touch. Think about how a newborn enters the world today, wrapped in cloth, placed in a plastic bassinet, sometimes carried to a separate room entirely. For 99% of human history, none of that existed. The baby went straight onto its mother's bare chest, skin against skin, and it stayed there. It fed there. It slept there. This wasn't sentiment. It was survival. A newborn cannot regulate its own body temperature. It cannot find food. It cannot escape a predator. For months, its mother's body wasn't just comfort, it was the entire environment it depended on to stay alive. Then there's the part almost nobody talks about, the placenta. This is one of the strangest patterns in all of anthropology. Cultures that never had contact with each other, separated by oceans and thousands of years, independently developed rituals around it. The Navajo bury it in the earth. Some Indonesian communities plant a tree over it. The Maori call it whenua, the same word they use for land, and bury it in a place tied to family history. Some West African traditions treat it as the baby's twin, a sibling that needs its own farewell. Nobody agreed on what to do with it, but almost everyone agreed it mattered. The placenta was never treated as waste. It was the first thing your body ever shared with another person, and somehow cultures that never spoke to each other all seemed to sense that. Now, here's where the story gets even stranger, because in ancient societies, societies, raising a child was never a job of one person. In 2009, anthropologist Sarah Blaffer Hrdy published research that reshaped how scientists understood human parenting. Her argument: humans are what biologists call cooperative breeders. Like certain birds and insects, we don't raise offspring in isolated pairs. The entire group invests. Mothers, grandmothers, siblings, cousins, friends. Scientists call this allomothering, meaning other mothering, and our species turns out to be extraordinarily good at it. Among the Fa people of Central Africa, researchers observed newborns being held by an average of 14 different people in a single day. Among the Hadza of Tanzania, babies are passed hand to hand constantly. A hungry infant might feed from another nursing woman if its own mother is away. Children as young as 4 or 5 carry babies on their hips like it's the most natural job in the world. This wasn't random kindness. It may have been one of the reasons our species survived at all. In the late 1990s, anthropologist Kristen Hawkes was studying the Hadza when she noticed something that didn't fit the assumptions of the time. The most productive food gatherers in camp weren't the young mothers in their 20s. They were the grandmothers, women in their 50s, 60s, even 70s, bringing home more food per day than women half their age. Why? Because they weren't slowed down by carrying an infant. Humans are the only primate species where females routinely live for decades after they stop reproducing. Hawkes proposed that this wasn't an accident of biology, it was a strategy. A grandmother who kept gathering, kept feeding, kept freeing up her daughter to nurse and care for a newborn, effectively multiplied her family's chances of survival. This became known as the grandmother hypothesis, and it may be one reason human children have such an unusually long protected childhood compared to any other primate. And that constant web of hands meant something else. Ancient babies were almost never alone. Anthropologists have actually measured this. Among groups like the Hadza and the Aish of South America, infants spend somewhere between 90 and 95% of their day in physical contact with another human being. They sleep against a body. They wake against a body. They're carried in slings across a hip or chest while their mother walks, gathers, cooks, and talks. There is almost no time spent lying alone, staring at a ceiling. Researchers now call this the 4th trimester, the theory that human babies are born roughly 3 months too early compared to other primates, still needing the warmth, motion, and constant contact of the womb. Hunter-gatherer parenting provided that automatically just by carrying the baby everywhere. Modern parents have to consciously recreate what evolution once handled for free. And here's a detail that should stop you in your tracks. Hunter-gatherer babies almost never cry. A cross-cultural study tracking infant crying patterns found that babies in hunter-gatherer societies cry far less often and for far shorter periods than babies in industrialized nations. Colic, the kind of prolonged, unexplained crying that exhausts modern parents, is almost unheard of. It's not that the babies are different, it's that the response is different. When a Hadza infant so much as fusses, someone picks it up within seconds. There's no waiting it out. The need gets met before it ever becomes distress, and over time, the baby simply learns it never has to escalate to be heard. Breastfeeding followed the same rhythm. No schedules, no formula, no bottles. Across hunter-gatherer societies, the average weaning age sits between 3 and 4 years old, sometimes longer. The baby fed when it needed to, and the mother's body simply responded. But here is the part of this story that is genuinely hard to sit with. For all that closeness, all that constant contact, all that shared care, ancient childhood was brutally fragile. Skeletal evidence and comparisons with modern hunter-gatherer groups suggest that somewhere between 30 and 40% of children died before the age of 5. There were no antibiotics, no vaccines. A fever you'd clear today with a single prescription could end a short life within days. This is why so many ancient cultures waited to name a child. In many societies, A name wasn't given until the baby had survived the first weeks, the first months, sometimes the first year. Until then, the child existed in a kind of in-between state, arrived but not yet fully anchored to the group. The naming ceremony was the moment that changed that. Elders would gather. The baby might be marked with ochre or ash, blessed, given a name tied to the circumstances of its birth. Among the Mbuti of Central Africa, a child wasn't considered fully human until it had been formally welcomed by the forest itself, a ceremony binding it not just to its parents, but to the land it would live on for the rest of its life. The child never belonged only to its mother and father. It belonged to everyone and to the place itself. And that closeness didn't stop after infancy. It just changed shape. In modern life, childhood is something we deliberately separate from adulthood. Kids play with kids. Adults handle the real world somewhere else. That separation barely existed in hunter-gatherer societies. Anthropologist David Lancy, who has spent decades studying childhood across cultures, found that by age 3, a child was already following her mother into the field. By 5 or 6, she could forage on her own. By 8, a Hadza boy might be sent out alone with a small bow and come home with a bird he'd caught himself.
Children learned in mixed age groups, watching, copying, being trusted to try the things they saw adults doing. Adults rarely stepped in to referee arguments or direct play. Older children taught younger ones, and an entire culture passed sideways, kid to kid, through nothing more than a few months of extra experience. This is the world the human brain evolved to grow up in, and in barely a few generations, we've replaced almost all of it. We give birth in rooms full of strangers. We separate mother and newborn for testing. We swaddle, we bottle feed. We put babies in separate cribs in separate rooms. We expect infants to sleep alone, feed on a schedule, and stop crying because no one came. We wean in months instead of years. We send children to spend their days only with kids their exact same age, and save grandparents for holidays. None of this is how it worked for 300,000 years. We built it in the last few hundred. The original way of welcoming a person into the world was never a private act. It was the work of an entire band, a mother held by other hands, a baby passed from arms to arms to arms, a grandmother feeding the family, older children keeping watch, a placenta honored instead of discarded. The very first thing a newborn ever learned about existence was that it was not alone, and it would not be alone for a very long time. You weren't born into that world, but somewhere underneath everything modern life has layered on top, your body still expects it. A heartbeat, warmth, skin, the smell of someone who will not put you down. It might be the oldest welcome our species has ever known, and it's still, quietly, what every one of us is looking for.